The Libyan Desert, 1942. A British patrol sits motionless under the unforgiving sun, their hearts pounding against their rib cages. 3 German trucks rumble past, so close the men can smell the exhaust fumes, hear the soldiers chatting in German about their dinner plans. But the patrol remains invisible, not because they have superior technology, not because they dug into the sand, but because one man, against all ridicule, had spent hours cutting strips from a discarded parachute and weaving them into a camouflage net that everyone else called useless. This is the story of survival in the most hostile theater of World War II, where the real enemy was not the Afrika Korps, but the desert itself, where the difference between life and death often came down to one unconventional idea that nobody believed would work. Long before this moment of impossible camouflage, the war in North Africa had become a nightmare of attrition. Both sides were locked in a deadly dance across thousands of kilometers of sand, rock, and heat. The coast belonged to whoever controlled the ports. The desert interior belonged to no one, or at least, that was the assumption. In 1940, a British officer named Ralph Bagnold had a different idea. He understood something that most military planners had missed entirely. The empty spaces on the map were not obstacles to be avoided. They were highways to be exploited. If you're finding this story fascinating, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. The journey we're about to take goes deeper into some of the most audacious operations of the Second World War. Bagnold was not your typical soldier. Before the war, he had spent years exploring the Sahara as a civilian, mapping routes that appeared on no official charts. He knew how to navigate by the sun and stars. He knew which wadis, dry riverbeds, could be crossed, and which would swallow a vehicle whole. When he proposed creating a unit that would operate hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, using nothing but trucks and their wits, the British High Command initially dismissed him. Desert warfare, they believed, would be fought along the coast where supplies could be shipped in and wounded evacuated. Nobody would be crazy enough to venture into the interior. But Bagnold persisted, and in July 1940, the Long-Range Desert Group was born. Its mission was deceptively simple: reconnaissance, watch the enemy, report their movements, map their positions. The execution, however, was anything but simple. These men would drive their Chevrolet and Ford trucks into terrain that should have been impassable, covering distances that seemed impossible, surviving in conditions that bordered on suicidal. The LRDG patrols typically consisted of 10 to 15 men traveling in 5 or 6 vehicles. Each truck was modified extensively: extra fuel tanks, reinforced suspension, sand channels strapped to the sides for extraction when wheels dug into soft sand. They carried their own water, their own food, their own ammunition. Once they left base, they were on their own. No cavalry coming to the rescue, no air support, no radio contact except for brief encrypted messages. The desert would either keep them alive or kill them. And the desert was a merciless judge. Daytime temperatures could exceed 50 degrees Celsius. Metal surfaces became hot enough to blister skin on contact. Water evaporated from canteens. Engines overheated. Men who wandered away from their vehicles could die of dehydration within hours. At night, the temperature plummeted. Frost formed on sleeping bags. The same men who had sweated through their shirts during the day now shivered uncontrollably. But the greatest threat was not the heat or the cold. It was detection. The LRDG operated in spaces where any vehicle, any human presence, was immediately suspicious. The coastal roads were patrolled by German and Italian forces. Aircraft swept across the desert looking for anything out of place. A column of dust rising from moving trucks could be spotted from miles away, and once spotted, there was no escape. The flat terrain offered no natural cover, no forests to hide in, no buildings to shelter behind. You either hid or you died. This existential threat drove the LRDG to become masters of concealment. They painted their vehicles in colors that seemed absurd, salmon pink, for instance, which blended perfectly with the desert haze at dawn and dusk. They learned to move only during specific hours, when dust signatures were minimized. They studied how to position vehicles to avoid casting shadows visible from the air. They became experts at reading the terrain, finding the slightest depression or rock formation that might provide cover. And it was in this crucible of survival that the parachute silk camouflage net was born. The exact origins of this improvisation are difficult to pin down. The Desert War produced countless small innovations born from desperation and ingenuity. What we know is that at some point, members of these elite units began experimenting with parachute silk as a camouflage material. The silk had properties that made it ideal for desert conditions. It was lightweight, could be compacted into a small space, and its semi-translucent quality created visual effects that solid fabric could not achieve. A solid camouflage net thrown over a vehicle created hard edges and unnatural shadows. But parachute silk, especially when woven into an open mesh pattern, diffused light in subtle ways. It broke up outlines without creating the sharp boundaries that attracted the eye. When combined with strips of burlap or local vegetation, it could transform a truck into what appeared to be nothing more than a slight irregularity in the landscape. The innovation did not come from high command. Military procurement officers never issued parachute silk camouflage nets. Instead, individual soldiers scavenged material from failed parachute drops, from damaged equipment, from anywhere they could find it. They spent hours cutting the silk into strips, weaving it through netting material, attaching it to frames that could be quickly deployed. This was not official doctrine. This was survival instinct transformed into craft. And many men thought it was a waste of time. The skeptics had their reasons. Standard camouflage netting was issued through official channels. It was tested, approved, and considered adequate for the task. Why spend hours creating something unofficial, something unproven, something that looked like arts and crafts rather than military equipment? The men who spent their precious rest time cutting and weaving silk were often mocked by their peers. Save your energy. Use the standard kit. Stop pretending you're smarter than the Army. But one patrol leader refused to listen to the doubters. He had seen too many patrols discovered. He had studied too many aerial photographs showing how standard camouflage failed against trained observers. He understood something fundamental. The enemy was adapting. German reconnaissance pilots were becoming experts at spotting LRDG patrols. The standard camouflage patterns were becoming known quantities. What had worked 6 months ago no longer worked today. Survival required constant innovation. So he persisted with his parachute silk net, perfecting the weave, adjusting the color combinations, testing how it looked from different angles and distances. His patrol members watched him work, some with amusement, some with irritation. They were tired. They wanted to rest. They did not want to participate in what seemed like an obsessive hobby. Then came the mission that changed everything. The patrol had been tasked with observing enemy movements along a key supply route. Intelligence suggested that a major convoy would be passing through the area, and headquarters wanted confirmation of its composition. How many trucks? How many tanks? What kind of equipment? The information would be vital for planning upcoming operations. The problem was the location. The observation point offered excellent sightlines to the road, but almost no natural cover. A few scattered rocks, a slight depression in the ground, nothing that would hide a vehicle from a passing convoy. Standard doctrine would have suggested positioning the patrol further away, sacrificing observation quality for safety. But further away meant binoculars at maximum range, details missed, information lost. The patrol leader made a decision that his men questioned. They would set up close, dangerously close, and rely entirely on the parachute silk camouflage net to keep them hidden. If the net failed, they would be trapped in the open, visible to an enemy convoy that could call in reinforcements within minutes. There would be no escape, no fighting their way out. Discovery meant death or capture. The setup took hours. The patrol positioned their vehicles in the shallow depression, orienting them to minimize their profile. They deployed the parachute silk net over the entire position, weighting the edges with rocks, adjusting the fabric to eliminate any flapping that might catch attention. They scattered sand and stones on top of the silk, breaking up what little uniform color remained. They covered the windshields with fabric, knowing that even a single glint of sunlight off glass could betray their position. Then they waited. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part. In combat, adrenaline carries you forward. There is no time to think, only to react. But lying motionless under camouflage, waiting for an enemy that might never come, the mind has nothing to do but fear. Every sound becomes magnified. Every minute stretches into an hour. The men lay still, breathing shallowly, watching through carefully concealed observation slits. And then the convoy appeared. It was larger than expected. Trucks stretched back along the road, dozens of them loaded with supplies for the front. Armored vehicles accompanied the column, their gunners scanning the terrain for threats. This was not a routine supply run. This was a significant movement of material, exactly the kind of intelligence that headquarters needed. The lead vehicles rumbled past at a distance. The patrol members tracked them with their eyes, mentally noting the composition. So far, so good. The camouflage was holding, but then the convoy began to slow. Something was happening ahead, a breakdown, a checkpoint, some obstruction on the road. Trucks pulled to the side, engines idling. Soldiers climbed down from their vehicles, stretching their legs, walking toward the patrol's position. 3 feet. That was the distance. German soldiers walked within 3 feet of the concealed patrol, so close that the British men could hear individual conversations. One soldier lit a cigarette, the smell of tobacco drifting over the hidden position. Another complained about the heat, about the food, about the war that seemed to have no end. They had no idea they were standing beside enemy soldiers who could hear every word. The patrol members did not breathe. They did not blink. They became part of the landscape, as still as the rocks scattered around them. The parachute silk net, mocked by so many, performed exactly as its creator had hoped. It did not hide the patrol through opacity, but through confusion. The visual information it presented to the German soldiers' eyes made no sense as a military position, so their brains processed it as terrain. Nothing to see here, just sand and scrub and the endless desert. After what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, the obstruction ahead cleared. The convoy reformed, engines roaring back to life. The soldiers returned to their vehicles. The column moved on, disappearing into the distance, leaving the patrol untouched, undiscovered, alive. When they were certain the convoy was gone, the patrol members allowed themselves to breathe again. Several men were shaking. One had tears in his eyes. They had just survived an encounter that should have been impossible. And they had survived because one man had refused to accept that standard equipment was good enough. The information they gathered on that mission proved valuable. But more valuable was the lesson learned. Innovation could mean the difference between life and death. The parachute silk camouflage technique spread through the LRDG and eventually to other units operating in the desert. What had been mocked became standard practice. What had been one man's obsession became unit doctrine. This pattern, individual innovation becoming collective wisdom, defined the Special Forces culture in North Africa. The Long-Range Desert Group was never a rigid military hierarchy where orders flowed down and obedience flowed up. It was an organization that valued results over protocol, effectiveness over tradition. If a man had an idea that might save lives, he was encouraged to try it. If the idea worked, it was adopted. If it failed, The failure was analyzed and learned from. This culture was not accidental. It was deliberately created by the unit's founders and commanders, men who understood that conventional military thinking was unsuited to unconventional warfare. Ralph Bagnold himself had been an innovator before the war, pushing the boundaries of desert exploration when experts said it could not be done. The officers he recruited shared his mindset: David Lloyd Owen, Guy Prendergast, and others who valued adaptability over adherence. The LRDG's success attracted attention from another unconventional thinker, David Sterling, a young officer who would become one of the most celebrated commandos of the war. Sterling had a vision that went beyond reconnaissance. He wanted to strike at the enemy, to destroy aircraft, to sabotage supply lines, to make the Germans feel vulnerable even in their rear areas. The long-range desert group had proven that it was possible to move through the desert undetected. Sterling proposed using that capability for direct action. In 1941, with the support of General Neil Ritchie and the reluctant tolerance of Middle East Command, Sterling created the Special Air Service. The name was deliberate misdirection. There was nothing airborne about the unit's early operations, and the Phantom Brigade Sterling referenced did not exist. The deception was meant to confuse German intelligence, to make them imagine paratroopers descending from the sky, when in fact the attackers were driving across the sand. The SAS's first mission, Operation Squatter, in November 1941, was a disaster. Sterling planned to parachute his men onto targets near Gazala and Timimi airfields, timing the attack to support a major British offensive. But a storm struck on the night of the drop. Wind speeds exceeded 30 knots. Visibility collapsed to near zero. The aircraft could not locate their drop zones accurately. Parachutists landed scattered across miles of desert, equipment lost, men injured, objectives unreachable. Of the 62 men who jumped, only 21 returned. The failure should have been the end. Middle East Command had never wanted the SAS to exist. They had tolerated Sterling's experiment, waiting for it to fail so they could disband the unit and return its men to conventional duties. Operation Squatter gave them the excuse they needed. But Sterling refused to accept defeat. Instead of retreating to Cairo to explain himself, he went directly to the LRDG. If parachuting was too unreliable, he would travel by truck. The Desert Raiders agreed to transport SAS teams to their targets, providing the mobility that the failed parachute insertion had lacked. The next operations were spectacularly successful. Small teams of SAS men, delivered to the vicinity of enemy airfields by LRDG patrols, infiltrated on foot under cover of darkness. They placed explosive charges on parked aircraft, timed to detonate after the raiders had escaped. In a single night in December 1941, Sterling's men destroyed over 20 aircraft at Sirte. They returned days later and destroyed more. The Germans could not believe what was happening. Entire squadrons of aircraft eliminated by handfuls of men who seemed to materialize from nowhere. The relationship between the SAS and LRDG became the foundation of British special operations in North Africa. The LRDG provided transport, navigation, and reconnaissance. The SAS provided the striking power. Together they created a model of special forces cooperation that persists to this day. And both units relied heavily on camouflage techniques that had been developed through trial and error in the desert. The parachute silk nets, the terrain-matching paint schemes, the discipline of remaining motionless for hours, these were not incidental skills. They were the core competencies that made everything else possible. Rommel himself recognized the threat. In communications intercepted by British intelligence, the German commander referred to the Desert Raiders as more troublesome than any unit of equivalent size. The SAS, Rommel observed, caused damage not only to equipment but to morale. His soldiers could no longer feel safe anywhere. The front lines were dangerous, but so were the rear areas. There was no sanctuary. The morale impact was difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. German and Italian soldiers who had to guard airfields and supply depots against potential raids were soldiers who could not be sent to the front. Security measures consumed resources, searchlights, barbed wire, guards, patrols, that might otherwise have been devoted to offensive operations. The desert raiders created uncertainty, and uncertainty consumed energy. The techniques that enabled these operations continued to evolve throughout the desert campaign. As the Germans adapted, the raiders adapted faster. When aerial reconnaissance improved, camouflage discipline tightened. When security around airfields increased, new infiltration methods were developed. The SAS began using jeeps mounted with twin Vickers K machine guns, racing onto airfields and strafing parked aircraft rather than planting bombs by hand. The LRDG expanded its operations, establishing forward bases that allowed extended operations deep in enemy territory. One innovation deserves special attention because it illustrates the creative extremes to which these units would go: the Special Interrogation Group. This unit, created in early 1942 under a Captain Herbert Cecil Buck, consisted largely of German-speaking Jewish soldiers from Palestine and Europe. Their mission was to impersonate Afrika Korps soldiers using captured uniforms, vehicles, and documents to infiltrate enemy positions. The SIG was perhaps the most dangerous assignment of the war. Its members knew that capture would mean certain death. German soldiers might be taken prisoner and expect eventual release. But Jewish soldiers in German uniforms, carrying false papers, conducting espionage operations, they would be executed immediately, either as spies or as Jews, or both. The unit trained intensively at a base in the Suez Canal zone. They learned Afrika Korps slang, procedures, saluting protocols, and cultural references. They carried German paybooks, German cigarettes, German chocolate. They even posed with British women in staged photographs meant to represent girlfriends back in the fatherland. The deception had to be perfect because imperfection meant death. The SIG conducted operations that seem almost unbelievable in hindsight. Dressed as German military police, they set up roadblocks on enemy supply routes, stopping and questioning actual German soldiers and extracting intelligence. They infiltrated cafes and mingled with enemy personnel, gathering information through casual conversation. The audacity was breathtaking, Jewish soldiers chatting with men who would have murdered them instantly if they knew the truth. But the SIG's most ambitious operation ended in disaster. In June 1942, they participated in a combined raid with Free French SAS soldiers against airfields at Derna and Martuba. The operation was betrayed by two German POWs who had been recruited as trainers for the unit. These men, Walter Essner and Herbert Bruckner, had claimed to be anti-Nazis eager to fight against Hitler. Instead, they warned the Germans about the incoming raid, leading to the death or capture of most of the French participants. The betrayal at Derna exposed a fundamental vulnerability of unconventional operations, the need for trust in an environment where trust could be fatal. The SIG continued operations after this disaster, but the unit was always haunted by the knowledge that deception could work both ways. The raid on Tobruk in September 1942 further illustrated both the potential and the limitations of special operations. This massive effort combined the LRDG, SAS, commandos, Marines, and infantry in an attempt to seize the vital port. The SIG played a crucial role in getting the force through German checkpoints. Their command of the German language, their authentic-looking documents, their convincing performance as Afrika Korps soldiers got the convoy past sentries who should have stopped them. But the larger operation fell apart. Naval forces were detected before they could land their Marines. Air support failed to materialize as planned. Communications broke down. The commandos fought bravely, but were overwhelmed. Lieutenant Colonel John Hazelden, the operations commander, was killed leading a desperate counterattack. The survivors faced a 400-mile walk back to British lines, evading enemy patrols and relying on friendly Arab tribes for assistance. The failure at Tobruk led to the disbandment of the Special Interrogation Group. The Army concluded that the unit's unique capabilities were no longer needed as the Desert War shifted decisively in the Allies' favor. But the men of the Sigi were not simply discharged. They were absorbed into the SAS, their skills and experience adding to the growing expertise of Sterling's regiment. By late 1942, the tide of the Desert War had turned. The Second Battle of El Alamein, fought in October and November, broke the back of the Afrika Korps and sent Rommel into retreat. The pursuing British forces advanced hundreds of miles in weeks, capturing territory that had been fought over for years. The role of special forces in this victory was significant, but often overlooked in narratives focused on conventional battles. The LRDG and SAS had not won the war by themselves. They had not destroyed enough aircraft or captured enough supplies to change the strategic balance on their own. But they had contributed something equally valuable: uncertainty. They had made the Germans fear the desert that should have been their ally. They had forced the allocation of resources to security rather than offense. They had demonstrated that no position was truly safe, that the enemy could appear anywhere at any time. And they had pioneered techniques that would influence special operations for generations to come. The camouflage methods developed in the North African desert became foundational knowledge for commando and reconnaissance units worldwide. The understanding that concealment was not just about hiding, but about manipulating perception. This insight drove developments in camouflage technology throughout the war and beyond. The Ghost Army in Europe, which used inflatable tanks and recorded sounds to deceive the Germans, drew on the same principles of visual deception that the Desert Raiders had pioneered. The parachute silk camouflage net, that improvised creation mocked by skeptics until a convoy passed 3 feet away, represented something larger than itself. It represented the willingness to question assumptions, to experiment when conventional solutions failed, to trust individual judgment over institutional doctrine. This mindset became the defining characteristic of Special Operations Forces, not their weapons or their training, but their adaptability. David Sterling was captured in January 1943, betrayed to a German patrol that had been hunting him specifically. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, escaping multiple times, but always being recaptured. The Germans, recognizing his threat potential, eventually sent him to Colditz, the maximum security camp reserved for the most troublesome Allied prisoners. But the SAS survived its founder's capture. The regiment continued operations in North Africa and then expanded into new theaters: Sicily, Italy, France, the Netherlands, Germany itself. The techniques pioneered in the desert were adapted to new terrain, new enemies, new challenges. The organization that had started as 60 men with an idea had grown into a force that would shape the outcome of campaigns across Europe. After the war, the SAS was initially disbanded. The British military establishment, never entirely comfortable with irregular warfare, saw no peacetime role for commandos who had made their reputation through unorthodox methods. The LRDG suffered the same fate. The men who had survived years of desert operations were thanked for their service and sent home, but the world refused to stay peaceful. Colonial insurgencies, communist guerrillas, new forms of conflict that did not fit conventional military categories. These challenges demanded the kind of skills that the Desert Raiders had developed. In 1952, the SAS was reformed for operations in Malaya. The regiment has remained active ever since, evolving through decades of counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and special operations across the globe. The Long Range Desert Group has no equivalent modern successor. Its specific mission, long-range reconnaissance across hostile terrain, has been partially superseded by technology, by satellites and drones, and signals intelligence. But the spirit of the LRDG lives on in every reconnaissance unit that operates beyond the front lines, gathering information that cannot be collected any other way. And somewhere in the institutional memory of these forces, the story of the parachute silk camouflage net survives. It is a small story in the larger narrative of the war. No battles decided, no cities liberated, no famous generals involved. Just a few men lying motionless in the sand while an enemy convoy rumbled past close enough to touch. But that small story contains something essential about how wars are really fought. Not just through grand strategy and massive armies, but through countless individual moments where one person's decision makes the difference. The decision to keep working on a camouflage net when others mocked the effort. The decision to position the patrol close to the road rather than at a safe distance. The decision to trust the fabric and the technique when trusting them meant risking everything. The men who lay under that parachute silk net did not know they would survive. They did not know that their intelligence would prove valuable. They did not know that their technique would be adopted by others, spreading through the desert forces and beyond. They knew only that they had done everything possible to remain unseen, and that the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died. The convoy passed, they lived, and a camouflage technique that had been laughed at became legend. In the end, the story of the Desert Raiders is not about technology or tactics or even courage, though all three were present in abundance. It is about the willingness to think differently when conventional thinking failed. The vast emptiness of the Sahara, which should have been impossible to cross and suicidal to hide in, became instead a highway for raiders and a sanctuary for those who learned its secrets. The same desert that killed the unprepared protected those who adapted. The parachute silk net was one adaptation among many. The salmon-pink trucks were another. The elaborate discipline of leaving no tracks, casting no shadows, making no movement was another still. Each innovation built on those that came before, creating a body of knowledge that transformed impossible operations into achievable missions. This is the inheritance of modern special operations forces, not specific techniques which evolve constantly as enemies adapt and technology changes, but a way of thinking. Assume nothing. Question everything. Find solutions where others see only problems. And when conventional wisdom says something cannot be done, that is precisely when creative minds should be searching for ways to do it. The convoy that passed 3 feet from a British patrol in the Libyan desert is long forgotten by history books that focus on decisive battles and famous commanders. But in that moment, on that day, a handful of men proved something that matters. Survival belongs to those who adapt. Innovation trumps doctrine. And sometimes the most powerful weapon is an idea that nobody else believed would work. The desert keeps its secrets. The sand covers tracks within hours, erases evidence within days. The positions where patrols hid, the routes they traveled, the exact locations of their most desperate moments, most of these are lost forever, known only to men who are now gone. But the lesson remains. When facing impossible odds in hostile terrain against a superior enemy, the conventional response is to retreat, to wait for reinforcement, to accept that some things cannot be done. The unconventional response is to ask what advantage might exist in the impossibility itself. The LRDG found their advantage in spaces that everyone else considered impassable. The SAS found their advantage in striking where the enemy felt safest. And one patrol found their advantage in strips of silk cut from a discarded parachute, woven into a net that kept them alive when death passed close enough to smell. That is how wars are won, not all at once in thundering victories, but piece by piece, moment by moment, through countless acts of ingenuity and courage that never make the history books, but make the history possible. The men under that net did not change the war. They were one patrol among many, one moment among millions. But they embodied something that deserves to be remembered: the human capacity to survive through adaptation, to thrive through creativity, and to prevail not because we are the strongest, but because we refuse to stop thinking. The silk net was made from parachutes that had failed their original purpose. Some had carried men on missions that never reached their objectives. Some had drifted in storms, landed in wrong locations, delivered soldiers to disaster rather than triumph. The silk itself was salvage, remnant, leftover material from operations that had gone wrong. And yet that salvaged silk, cut and rewoven by hands that refused to accept standard equipment as good enough, became the membrane between life and death for the men it sheltered. What had failed in one form succeeded in another. What had been discarded became essential. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the improvised camouflage net. There are no useless materials, only failures of imagination about how to use them. The war in North Africa ended in May 1943 with the surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia. The desert that had consumed so much blood and treasure over 3 years of fighting fell silent. The tracks faded, the foxholes filled with sand, the wrecked vehicles rusted and disappeared under dunes. But the men who had fought there carried the desert with them for the rest of their lives. They dreamed of sand and heat. They woke expecting to hear engines in the distance. They retained habits of observation and concealment that never quite disappeared. The desert had changed them in ways they could not always articulate, had taught them things about themselves and about survival that peacetime could never replicate. And somewhere among those lessons, preserved in memory and passed down through generations of soldiers who came after, was the story of a camouflage net made from parachute silk. A story about thinking differently, a story about trusting innovation over tradition, a story about lying perfectly still while an enemy passed close enough to touch. They laughed at the parachute silk camouflage net until the convoy passed 3 feet away. After that, nobody laughed anymore. They learned.